I was 70 years old, and I believed the woman my son brought home was a blessing. I was wrong. On Logan's wedding day, as I smiled at the bride and thought my family would grow bigger, she looked at me in a way I'll never forget. Not the look of a daughter-in-law. It was the look of someone calculating how much longer she'd have to put up with this old woman. Like, comment with the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has gone. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will leave you speechless. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to admit, even to myself. For most of my adult life, I believed that if you loved someone unconditionally, they would eventually feel that love and return it in kind. I believed that patience was a virtue, that family was sacred, that blood and loyalty meant something permanent. My late husband Gerald used to say I had too much faith in people. He'd say it with a soft kind of sadness, like he could see something I couldn't. I used to laugh it off. I thought he was being cynical. I understand now what he meant. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 70 years old. I have lived on this land, 32 acres of it, for 41 years. I raised my son here. I buried my husband here. I tended the garden here through summers so hot the ground cracked and winters that turned the creek to glass. This place is not just property to me. It is the shape of my entire life. And for a period of nearly 2 years, I came within a signature of losing all of it. The story I'm about to tell you begins, as the worst betrayals always do, with a smile. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, or rather, Vanessa Carter, after the wedding. Logan brought her home for the first time on a Thursday evening in late September. I remember the exact quality of the light that day, that amber gold that pours through the kitchen window right before sunset and makes everything look like an old photograph. I had made pot roast. I had set the table with the good dishes. I heard his truck on the gravel before I saw it, and I felt that flutter in my chest, the one I hadn't felt since he was a little boy coming home from school. Logan was 43 years old, and he still had that effect on me. He was my only child. He was, for a long time, the center of my world, and I am not ashamed of that, though I have since come to understand how much of my blindness about him grew from that very love. He came through the back door first, and then she stepped in behind him, and I'll be honest with you. My first thought was that she was beautiful, not in a warm way, in a precise way. She looked like a woman who had been assembled very carefully. Her hair was that particular shade of dark auburn that doesn't happen by accident. Her clothes were understated but expensive, the kind of expensive that doesn't announce itself, that just makes cheaper things look smaller by comparison. She was maybe 38. She had a handshake like a businesswoman and a smile that arrived exactly on cue. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I've heard so many wonderful things." I smiled back. I told her to call me Evelyn. I pulled the roast from the oven and we sat down to dinner and I watched my son watch her. And I remember thinking, he's gone. He's completely gone on this woman. The way a man looks at someone when he's lost himself inside the idea of her. I told myself that was a good thing. I had prayed for Logan to find someone, not in a religious way, just in the quiet, private way a mother hopes for her child's happiness. He'd had a rough decade, a failed marriage in his early 30s, some financial trouble he never fully explained to me, a period of distance between us that had only recently started to close. I thought Vanessa was the reason the distance was closing. I thought she was good for him. The dinner went fine. She complimented the roast. She asked about the property with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She said it was beautiful, that she'd never been out this far from the city, that she couldn't imagine how peaceful it must be. She held Logan's hand on the table. I washed the dishes after they left, and I thought, well, maybe this will work out after all. That was my first mistake. Not the trusting. I think trust is mostly a reasonable instinct. The mistake was what I chose not to notice, because I wanted so badly to believe. Amuk. They came back 3 more times before Thanksgiving. Each visit was pleasant enough, or close enough to pleasant, that I couldn't put a name to what felt off. But something did feel off. Little things. The way Vanessa's eyes moved around the house when she thought I wasn't watching, not with admiration but with assessment. The way she'd pick up an object and turn it over in her hands, a framed photo, a piece of pottery I'd had for 20 years, and set it back down without comment. The way she'd ask questions about the property that went slightly past the point of polite curiosity. "How many acres did you say?" she asked once, the second visit. 32, I said. She nodded. And you manage all of this yourself, since Gerald passed? I have some help, I said. Neighbors. A man named Dale, who does the heavy maintenance. That must be exhausting, she said. At your age. There it was. I caught it, and I let it pass because I am a woman who has spent 70 years learning to pick her battles. But I filed it away. At your age. She had been here twice, and she was already measuring me against my age. Logan didn't catch it, or if he did, he didn't react. He was in the other room looking at his phone. By Thanksgiving, I had added 3 more small moments to my quiet collection of things I wasn't sure what to make of. They weren't big enough to confront anyone about. They never are at first. That's the whole design of it. I know now. The small things are meant to accumulate without ever crossing the line where you can point at them clearly and say, there, that is the problem. The engagement happened fast. February. Logan called me on a Sunday morning and told me they were getting married in June, 4 months away. That's quick, I said. I know, he said. But when you know, Mom. I asked if I could throw them an engagement dinner. He sounded pleased. He said he'd check with Vanessa. She agreed to the dinner, but she had suggestions about the guest list, about the food, about what I should or shouldn't bring up in conversation. She said it all with that careful smile, framing everything as thoughtfulness. I just want it to be comfortable for everyone. You know how Logan gets when politics come up. Maybe we keep it small. I get overwhelmed in large groups. I kept the party small. I made the food she preferred. I didn't bring up anything that might disturb anyone. And I remember sitting at my own table that night, in my own house, and feeling like a guest. My oldest friend, Dorothy, pulled me into the kitchen at one point and looked at me over her reading glasses and said quietly, Evelyn, I need you to tell me you're not just going along with everything that woman says. She's nervous, I said. New family, new situation. Dorothy pressed her lips together. She didn't push it. But she looked at me the way Gerald used to, like she could see the thing I was choosing not to see. The wedding was June 14th. I want to be careful here because I don't want to rewrite what happened through the lens of what I know now. In the moment, I was trying very hard to simply be a mother at her son's wedding. I wore the dress I'd bought with Dorothy, a soft blue that Logan had always said looked good on me. I had my hair done. I brought a card and a check and a handwritten letter, because I believe in handwritten letters. But from the moment I arrived at the venue, a rented hall about 40 minutes outside of town, nicer than I'd expected, something felt wrong in my body. Not a thought. A physical sensation. A low, persistent pressure in my sternum, like before a storm. The seating had been arranged by Vanessa. I discovered my seat at the ceremony during the rehearsal walk-through the evening before, and I stood there for a moment and just looked at it. Row 4. Not the front row. Not even the second. Row 4, on the end, slightly behind a column that partially obstructed the altar. There must be a mistake, I said to no one in particular. One of the venue staff glanced at the chart. Mrs. Carter, that's what was written. I found Logan. He was with the groomsmen, laughing about something. I touched his arm, and he turned and I showed him the seating chart. He looked at it. He looked at me. And then he said, Mom, Vanessa did most of the planning. I didn't really get involved in the seating. Row 4, I said, behind a column. I'm sure it's fine, he said. You'll still be able to see. I stood there and looked at my son, this man I had raised, and I thought, this is not about the seating. The seating is just the part I can point to. What I can't point to is the thing underneath it, the decision that led to the seating, the conversation that was had about where to put the mother of the groom. I went back to my seat. I sat in row 4. I watched my son marry Vanessa Brooks behind a column. At the reception, I found myself at a table with people I didn't know. 2 of Vanessa's cousins and their spouses, all of them polite but clearly confused about who I was. I introduced myself as Logan's mother. One of them looked mildly surprised. Oh, she said, I thought his mother was... I didn't realize you'd be here. I didn't ask what she'd thought. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Vanessa made her rounds through the reception with the focused efficiency of a woman completing a task. She reached our table last. She hugged the cousins, laughed at something one of the husbands said, and then turned to me and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evelyn," she said, "I'm so glad you could come." Like I was a guest, like I was someone who had been graciously included. Not the mother of the groom, not the woman who had rocked Logan to sleep for 3 years and driven him to every baseball practice, and sat with him through his divorce, and loved him through every version of himself he'd ever been. I could come. How lovely that I could come. I smiled back. I said congratulations. I hugged my son when he came by, and he held on for a moment longer than I expected, and I told myself that meant something. I drove home alone that night. The house was quiet. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off for a long time before I went to bed. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Portugal. I knew this because Logan texted me a photo of the ocean on day 3 and nothing else. I texted back, "Beautiful. Thinking of you both." He sent a thumbs up. When they returned, Logan called less. Not completely gone. He's not a cruel man, my son. But the calls became shorter, more distracted. He'd pick up, and then I'd hear Vanessa's voice somewhere in the background, not saying anything clearly, just present, and Logan would say, "Hey, Mom, can I call you back in a bit?" And sometimes he did, and sometimes he didn't. I didn't push. I have never been the kind of mother who demands. Maybe that was another mistake. I've thought about it a great deal. They came for Sunday dinner the first week of August, the first time I'd seen either of them since the wedding. I had made Logan's favorite, chicken and dumplings, a recipe that had been my mother's. I'd been looking forward to it all week. Vanessa was in a particular mood that day, not rude exactly, more like a woman who had decided to dispense with pretense because she felt secure enough to do so. She sat down at my kitchen table and looked around with an expression I can only describe as someone appraising real estate. "How long have you had this kitchen?" she asked. "Since Gerald and I renovated it in 1998, I said. "About 26 years? She said. Not cruelly, just that sound, the sound of quiet dismissal. Over dinner, she began. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you'd feel foolish calling out directly. She mentioned a neighbor of theirs, an older woman, who had recently moved into a care facility. "She seemed so capable," Vanessa said. "Right up until she wasn't. These things can change overnight, at a certain age." I looked at her. She looked at her food. "I'm in good health," I said. "Of course," she said quickly. "Of course you are, Evelyn. I'm just saying, it's smart to plan ahead. Logan and I have been thinking about it, actually, about what makes the most sense, long term, for everyone." Logan was looking at his plate. "Logan," I said, "what have you been thinking?" He set down his fork. "Just, practical stuff, Mom. Like, this property is a lot to manage, and we worry about you being out here alone." "I've been out here alone for 4 years," I said, "since your father passed." "I know," he said. "But you weren't 70 then." There it was. Again. The age. Always the age. I got up and refilled the breadbasket, and when I came back to the table, I changed the subject to his work, and we got through the rest of the dinner without another incident. But when they left, I sat down in Gerald's old armchair in the living room, and I thought very clearly, with a steadiness that surprised me, something is coming. I don't know what it is yet, but something is coming. September brought a visit I hadn't expected. Logan called Tuesday morning and said Vanessa was in the area and wanted to stop by. Just Vanessa, not Logan. She arrived at 11 with a leather folder under one arm and an expression I was beginning to recognize, that polished concern, that practiced care. We sat in the living room. She declined coffee. "Evelyn," she said, "I want to talk to you honestly, woman to woman." I said nothing. I watched her. "Logan worries about you. I know he doesn't always say it directly. That's just how he is. But he lies awake at night. This property, your finances, making sure you're protected, it's a lot of anxiety for him." "I wasn't aware he was anxious," I said. "He doesn't want to burden you," she said. "But the truth is, managing this kind of estate, the upkeep, the tax implications, It's complicated, Evelyn. And at some point, it might make more sense to simplify. Simplify, I repeated. Sell the property, she said, and she said it smoothly, like it was the natural next word after the previous ones, like it followed logically and had nothing to do with anything other than my well-being. Use the equity. Move somewhere with community around you. Assisted living facilities now are really remarkable. They're nothing like what people imagine. I looked at this woman who had been my daughter-in-law for 11 weeks, this woman who had seated me behind a column at my own son's wedding. I'll keep that in mind, I said. She stayed another 20 minutes. She left the leather folder on my coffee table. I waited until her car was off the gravel and then I opened it. Inside were brochures for 3 assisted living facilities and a 1-page summary, typed, professional-looking, outlining the estimated value of my property and what a sale might yield. Someone had put real time into this. Someone had researched my property's estimated value. Someone had prepared materials. I closed the folder. I sat there for a long time. Then I got up and walked through my house, every room, slowly. The kitchen with the window that catches the afternoon light. The hallway where Logan's school photos still lined the wall because I'd never taken them down. The room that had been Gerald's study, that still smelled faintly like him on certain days when the weather was a particular kind of damp. My bedroom, where I had slept in the same bed for 40 years. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the table, and I did something I hadn't done in quite a while. I let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. Not the polite version of it, the real version. The version where my son's wife had just sat in my living room and told me to sell my home and move into a facility because... What? Because it would be easier for them? Because she'd done the math and didn't like the answer? I felt something harden in me that day. Not anger, exactly. Or not just anger, something older and quieter than anger. Something that said, you have lived through things that would have broken other people. You buried your husband. You raised a child alone for periods. You kept this land. You are not going to hand it to someone who calculated its value before she'd been married 3 months. You are not going to sign anything. But I also understood that I was alone, and that whatever they were planning was more organized than a casual conversation over Sunday dinner. That folder told me that. The typed summary told me that. Someone had made calls, done research, prepared materials. I needed to be smarter than they expected me to be. That night I called Dorothy. That folder, Dorothy said when I'd finished telling her. Her voice had gone very flat. She left it in your house. On my coffee table, I said. A long silence. Then, Evelyn, you need a lawyer. I know, I said. Not someone Logan knows, someone yours. I know, I said, again. I had a name already, actually. A man Gerald had mentioned once, years ago, an attorney who handled estate and property law, someone Gerald had done business with briefly. Calvin Mercer. I didn't know if he still practiced, but I was going to find out. I set the brochures on the kitchen counter and I looked at them for a moment. Then I picked them up and put them in the recycling bin, and I went to bed. I slept better than I'd expected to. I want to be clear about something. Even as I tell you this story, I did not stop loving my son during any of this. That's the part that doesn't get said often enough, I think. You can love someone completely and still see clearly that they are doing you harm. The love doesn't protect you from the harm. In some ways, it makes it harder to protect yourself because you keep hoping the person will choose differently if you just give them the right moment, the right words, the right look across a table. I had given Logan those moments. I had given him those words. He had looked at his plate. He was a grown man who had made his choices. I couldn't make them for him. All I could do was make mine. October. I contacted Calvin Mercer's office on a Thursday morning from my cell phone, in my car, parked a half-mile down the road from my house. I didn't fully know why I took those precautions. Instinct. A feeling that the walls might have ears, which is a paranoid thought for a woman sitting alone in her own house, and yet I trusted the instinct. His assistant told me he still practiced, that he had a small firm 2 towns over, that he specialized in estate law and elder asset protection. That last phrase, elder asset protection, was not something I'd encountered before, but I understood immediately why it existed. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. That weekend, Logan called and asked if he and Vanessa could come for dinner the following Sunday. I said, of course. He sounded relieved, which told me something. He sounded like a man who'd expected a harder conversation and was glad it hadn't happened yet. Vanessa wasn't mentioned in the call. I didn't bring up the folder. We talked for 12 minutes about his work and the weather and whether the garden had done well this year. I said the garden had been wonderful this year, that the tomatoes especially had been something remarkable, that Gerald would have loved them. Logan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yeah, he would have. Some part of him was still in there. That's the thing that kept breaking my heart. Some part of the boy I'd raised was still in there, under all of it. I just didn't know yet whether it was enough. Welcome, Tuesday. Calvin Mercer's office was in a brick building on the main street of a town called Harwick, which was small enough that I didn't recognize anyone when I walked in. I was glad of that. He was a man of about 60, with the kind of face that had been arranged by decades of listening to difficult stories without flinching. He shook my hand. He offered coffee. He sat down and he listened. I told him everything: the wedding, the dinners, the visits, the folder with the brochures and the typed summary. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mrs. Carter, Evelyn, what you're describing is a pattern that I see with some regularity. It has a name. Financial elder abuse doesn't always look like theft. Sometimes it looks like concern. The words landed somewhere deep in my chest. What I'd like to do, he said, is understand the full picture of your assets, your property, your accounts, any outstanding financial arrangements. There's something, I said. Something I haven't told anyone. He waited. I told him about the ranch. 40 years ago, before Gerald and I had Logan, before the property on Miller Road where we built our home and our life, Gerald had inherited a parcel of land from his uncle, a working cattle ranch about 60 miles east, through terrain that got rough enough that most people didn't know it was there. When Gerald's uncle died, the land came to Gerald outright, and Gerald, being Gerald, quiet and careful and thinking 20 years ahead, had put the deed solely in my name. He said, I told Calvin Mercer, that a man never knows what'll happen to him, and he wanted to make sure I'd always have something that nobody could take from me. At the time, I'd thought it was a sweet gesture, a loving one. I hadn't really thought about the value. And no one knows about this property? Calvin asked carefully. Gerald's lawyer knew, I said. Gerald's lawyer is dead. The deed is in my safe at home. I never refinanced it, never listed it, never borrowed against it. It has no mortgage. It has tenants. A family has been running cattle on it for 12 years and paying me a lease. Calvin Mercer looked at me for a moment. Then he said, Evelyn, do you know what that land is worth today? I told him what Gerald had estimated a long time ago. Calvin was quiet again, but this time the quality of the quiet was different. He turned to his computer. He typed something. He turned the monitor to face me. I looked at the number. I sat very still for a moment. That's the current estimated market value, he said, based on land records and comparable sales in that region. It may be higher. There's been significant development interest in that corridor in the past 18 months. The number was not what Gerald had estimated. The number was much, much larger. All right, I said when I found my voice. All right, he agreed. We talked for another 90 minutes about what protections existed, about what to document, about what to do if someone showed up with paperwork, about what to do if that paperwork had already been drafted somewhere that I didn't know about. When I left his office, the afternoon was cold and bright, and I sat in my car for a few minutes before I started the engine. Gerald had seen it. He'd seen it before there was anything to see, before Logan's marriage, before any of this. He'd looked ahead the way only Gerald could, that quiet, forward-facing intelligence that I had loved in him for 40 years, and he had made sure. I put my hand on the steering wheel. Thank you, I said, to no one in the car, and yet to someone specific. Then I drove home through the afternoon light, and I did not mention any of it to anyone. I set the table for Sunday dinner. I put Gerald's old cast iron on the stove, and I waited. Sunday dinner came and went without incident, which somehow made everything worse. Logan ate 2 helpings of the chicken and dumplings and told me it was just like he remembered, which should have felt like something good, and instead felt like watching a man stand on the edge of something he didn't know was there. Vanessa was pleasant, measured. She asked about my garden, commented on the curtains in the living room, helped clear the table without being asked. All of it performed with such consistency that I found myself, just for a moment, wondering if I had misread the folder, if maybe I had let suspicion outrun evidence. Then, as they were putting on their coats to leave, Vanessa turned to me with her hand on the door frame and said, "Evelyn, I've been meaning to ask, do you have a financial advisor, someone who manages your accounts?" Not aggressive, conversational, the way you'd ask someone if they'd seen a good movie recently. "I manage my own affairs," I said. "Of course," she said. Logan and I have someone wonderful if you ever wanted an introduction. These things can get complicated, especially estates that haven't been recently reviewed." I looked at her. She held my gaze with that practiced calm. "I'll keep it in mind," I said, the same words I'd used before, the same even tone. When their headlights left the driveway and the gravel went quiet, I stood at the kitchen window and let out a long breath. She was probing. Still probing. The folder hadn't worked, so now she was coming at it from another direction, through a financial advisor, through the idea of my accounts being complicated, through the same slow, patient pressure she'd been applying since August. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already been to see Calvin Mercer twice more since that first Tuesday in October. We had been building something, quietly, the way you build anything that has to be strong. Calvin had advised me to do several things that most people would consider excessive. Document every conversation. Keep a notebook, not on my phone, a physical notebook, and write down the date, the time, and the substance of anything Vanessa or Logan said to me about my property, my finances, my age, or my living situation. He told me not to change anything about my behavior, not to become cold or evasive, not to stop taking their calls or cancel dinners. He told me to be exactly who I had always been, because the moment I changed my behavior, I gave them a reason to tell a story about me. "People who do what I think they're doing," he said at our second meeting, "they need a narrative. They need you to seem confused, unstable, unable to manage your affairs. If you're the same Evelyn Carter you've always been, they don't have a story." So I remained exactly who I was. I answered my phone. I made dinners. I smiled at Vanessa's questions. And every night before bed, I opened the small green notebook I kept in the drawer of my nightstand and I wrote down what had been said. By November, I had 14 entries. They were not dramatic entries, individually. That was the thing that made the pattern so insidious, Paul. No single conversation would have alarmed anyone who read it in isolation. A comment about my age, a question about my finances, an offhand remark about the property being a burden for a woman alone, a brochure left on a table, an unsolicited suggestion about a financial advisor. Individually, they were the kinds of things people say without thinking. Together, they formed something. Calvin read through my notes at our third meeting and was quiet for a moment. "This is a campaign," he said, not angrily, just stating what was on the page. "I know," I said. "The question is what form it takes when it escalates. Because this will escalate, Evelyn. This kind of thing doesn't stop at suggestions. Eventually, they'll come to you with paperwork." I told him I understood. "When they do," he said, "I need you to call me before you read a word of it. Not after. Before." I told him I would. What I didn't tell him, not yet, was that I was also doing something else. Something he might have tried to talk me out of, or at least complicated with cautions and qualifications. I had started driving out to the ranch. Not all at once. I wasn't ready for that. The first time I just drove the highway until I hit the turnoff, then sat on the shoulder with the engine running and looked at the land through the windshield. 60 miles of nothing, gradually giving way to open pasture, to sky that goes wider than you remember sky being. The fencing was in better shape than I'd expected. The Delgado family, the tenants, Ramon and his wife Lucia and their 2 adult sons, had kept the place carefully. Better than carefully. They had loved it. The second time I drove all the way in, Ramon met me at the gate with the kind of careful deference a man shows when he isn't sure what a visit means, whether the land he's worked for 12 years is about to change hands or simply have its owner stand in it for an afternoon. I told him nothing had changed. I told him I just wanted to see the place. He relaxed visibly. He showed me around. The main house was a single-story structure, old but solid, with a covered porch that faced west toward a horizon that made you feel like the world had more room in it than you'd been operating under. The cattle were healthy. The creek that ran through the back 40 had been kept clear. They had built a small equipment shed with their own money and kept meticulous records of everything they'd spent on the property. I stood on that porch for a long time. Lucia brought out coffee. We sat in the cold air, and I looked at the land that Gerald had put in my name 40 years ago. The land he'd understood was a protection even when I didn't. And I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like myself. November became December, and the pressure from Vanessa increased in the way that Calvin had predicted. Not dramatically, but steadily, the way water gets into a foundation. She called me directly now. Not Logan. Her. She called on a Wednesday afternoon and asked how I was doing in a voice that had warmth on the surface and strategy underneath it. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "Being out there alone through the holidays? It must be quiet." "I like quiet," I said. "Of course," she said. "But Evelyn, honestly, how are things? The house, the upkeep, everything?" "Everything is fine, Vanessa." A pause. Then, "Logan and I have been talking. We feel like we haven't been doing enough, making sure you're taken care of. And I know you're independent. I know that's important to you. But part of loving someone is making sure they're not struggling in silence, you know?" I wrote it in the notebook that night. Struggling in silence. She had found a way to invent a problem that didn't exist and present it as concern for me. "I appreciate that," I had said on the phone. "I really do." She must have taken that as encouragement, because the next call came 4 days later. This time she mentioned a specific facility. Not the brochures from before, a new one, something she described as really more of a resort community than a care facility. She had a contact there. She could arrange a tour. "I don't need a tour," I said, and this time I let a small edge into my voice because I wanted her to hear it without making it a confrontation. A beat. "Okay," she said carefully. "I hear you. I hope you know this comes from a place of genuine care." "I know you care," I said. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. The careful phrasing, the retreating when pushed, then returning again. Genuine care. This comes from a place of genuine care. It was so practiced that it was almost impressive if you could detach from the thing it was being used to accomplish. I called Calvin the next morning. "It's moving faster," I told him. "I expected it would, around the holidays," he said. "People feel pressure around the end of the year, financial decisions, estate decisions. There's a psychological pull toward resolution. I want you to be ready, Evelyn. If they're going to make a move, it'll likely be early in the new year." "What kind of move?" I asked, though I had an idea. "Paperwork," he said. "Some kind of document that gives them authority over your assets. Power of attorney, or something disguised as a simpler arrangement. They may bring someone with them when they present it, make it feel official and routine." I looked out my kitchen window at the bare winter yard. "I'll be ready," I said. Ted. Christmas was strange. Logan came alone. Vanessa was visiting her family, he said, a trip that had been planned for months. I believed him, though I also noticed he hadn't mentioned it before. He arrived on Christmas Eve with a bottle of wine and the slightly sheepish energy of a man caught between two places, and not quite at home in either. We decorated the tree, the two of us. He put the star on top the way he had since he was 9 years old, standing on the second step of the stepladder, and for a while we were just a mother and son in a warm house in December, and it almost felt like nothing was wrong, almost. "Mom," he said at some point in the evening, sitting across from me with his wine glass. "Are you happy? Like, genuinely? Out here?" I looked at him. "This is my home, Logan." "I know, I'm not saying it isn't." He turned the glass in his hands. "I just wonder sometimes if you're lonely." "I have friends," I said. "Dorothy. The Hendersons down the road. I'm on the library board. I keep busy." "I know," he said again. He seemed to be building up to something and then not quite getting there. "I just want to know you're okay." Are you asking because you want to know? I said gently, or because someone else wants to know? He looked up, and there it was, a flash of something in his face. Not guilt exactly, awareness. He knew what I was asking. Mom, I'm not looking for an argument, I said. I'm just asking. Is this your question or Vanessa's? A long silence. He drank some wine. He looked at the tree. She worries about you, he said finally. That's all? It was not an answer. He knew it wasn't. I didn't push it further because I didn't want to ruin what little we had salvaged of the evening, and because I understood that pushing Logan directly had never worked and never would. He was not a man who arrived at things through confrontation. He arrived at them slowly, through accumulation, if he arrived at all. We watched an old movie after dinner, and he fell asleep in the armchair the way he used to when he was a teenager, mouth slightly open, looking younger than he was. I covered him with the quilt from the back of the couch and went to bed. In the morning, he made coffee, and we were careful with each other in the way you are when a conversation has gotten too close to the truth and retreated. He hugged me for a long time before he left. I love you, Mom, he said. I love you too, I said. And I meant it completely and without condition. Which was exactly why what was happening hurt the way it did. January 3rd. Vanessa called in the morning and said she and Logan wanted to come by that weekend. She had someone she wanted me to meet, a financial planner who could help simplify things. Her word, simplify. I had heard that word from her enough times now that it had lost all meaning and gained a new one. That sounds fine, I said. I called Calvin before I'd been off the phone with her for 60 seconds. This is it, he said after I'd described the call. You think? A financial planner with documents at a home visit, he said. Yes, that's the setup, Evelyn. They're not coming to have a conversation. They're coming with something to sign. I felt something cold move through me that wasn't quite fear, closer to the feeling right before something inevitable. What do I do? I asked. You let them come, Calvin said. You be exactly yourself. You don't refuse the meeting. You don't want to trigger anything before we're ready. But I need to know the date and time, and I need you to have your phone accessible. We've been building documentation for 3 months. If they present paperwork this weekend, we're going to be ready in a way they are not expecting. He told me what he was arranging. As he talked, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the small green notebook on the counter. 14 entries now, 18 with the December calls. One more thing, Calvin said. When they're there, let them talk. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. If they show you papers, take them, read them slowly, tell them you want to think it over. Just give them enough rope. Give them enough rope, I repeated. Exactly. After I hung up, I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the time of the call and what had been said. Then I closed it and put it back in the drawer. I looked around my kitchen, the window with the afternoon light, the cast iron on the stove, the photograph of Gerald and me on the wall by the doorway, taken the year we bought this property, the two of us standing in the front yard looking like people who had no idea yet what their lives were going to hold. We'd had no idea. But Gerald had still thought ahead. He had still put that ranch in my name with the quiet certainty of a man who loved someone enough to protect them from things neither of them could see yet. I had spent months feeling afraid, I realized. Afraid of what Vanessa was building toward. Afraid of what Logan would or wouldn't do. Afraid of what a signature on the wrong document might cost me. Sitting at that table, I felt the fear go somewhere else. Not gone, but moved aside, the way you set something heavy down so you can pick up the right tool. Whatever was coming on Saturday, I was not walking into it alone, and I was not walking in unprepared. I had spent 41 years on this land. I had built something here. Gerald had built something here. And somewhere 60 miles east, on pasture that carried his uncle's name and his careful love for me, there was a piece of this earth that not one person outside that law office in Harwick knew existed. They were coming to take everything from a woman they had decided was too old to defend herself. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Saturday came the way that dreaded things always do. Too quickly and with ordinary weather. A pale January sky, the ground still hard from the week's frost, the bare trees along the fence line standing like witnesses who had seen everything and said nothing. I was up at 6. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving, the way I used to sit before Gerald's harder medical appointments, the ones where we both understood the news might be something we couldn't take back. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over you when you know a day is going to change something. Not panic, not even dread exactly. Just a sharpness in the air, like every object in the room is slightly more present than usual. I had called Calvin the night before to confirm everything. He had told me to keep my phone in my cardigan pocket with the volume low. He told me he had arrangements in place and that I would not be alone in that room for long. He also told me, again, not to sign anything. Whatever I was shown, however it was framed, however casual or urgent or caring they tried to make it feel, not one signature. Even if I feel confused, I had said, half joking. You won't feel confused, he said. You're the sharpest person in this situation. They just don't know that. I dressed carefully that morning, not formally. I didn't want to signal that I was prepared for anything, but, well, the dark green sweater Logan had given me 2 birthdays ago. My good slacks. My hair done the way I always did it. I wanted to look exactly like what they had decided I was. A 70-year-old woman living alone in a house too big for her, a little soft around the edges, a little behind the times. I wanted to look like someone who trusted people too much. It was the easiest costume I'd ever worn, because it used to be who I was. They arrived at 11, which was later than they'd said, 10:30. And I had spent that half hour sitting in the living room with a book open in my lap that I did not read. When I heard the crunch of gravel, I didn't move immediately. I let them knock. There were 3 of them. Logan, Vanessa, and a man I didn't recognize. 50s, soft-spoken looking, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of forgettable blazer that says I'm a professional without specifying what kind. He was introduced as Paul Reeves. Vanessa said he was a financial and estate planning specialist who had helped several of their friends' parents through similar transitions. It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Carter, Paul Reeves said, shaking my hand with the measured warmth of a man trained to put elderly people at ease. Vanessa has told me so much about you. I smiled. I offered coffee. I brought out the good cups because I am my mother's daughter, and I will not stop being who I am for anyone, even in the middle of a war. We sat in the living room, Logan and Vanessa on the couch, Paul Reeves in the armchair across from me, his briefcase settled beside him like it had its own appointment. I sat in my chair, the one that had been Gerald's, with my hands folded and my face pleasant. Evelyn, Vanessa began, and I noticed she no longer asked whether she could call me that. We wanted to do this here, in your home, because we wanted it to feel comfortable, not like an office, not like something intimidating. I appreciate that, I said. The truth is, she continued, and she leaned forward slightly, that gesture of intimacy she'd perfected. Logan and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about making sure everything is structured the right way so that you're protected. I looked at Logan. He was looking at the coffee table. Protected from what? I asked. Paul Reeves smoothly took the question. Well, Mrs. Carter, from the unexpected, medical costs, property liabilities, the complexity that comes with managing an estate alone at a point in life when that complexity can become genuinely burdensome. What we're proposing is a structure that simplifies all of that for you. There was that word again, simplify. I see, I said. What kind of structure? He reached into the briefcase. The papers were more substantial than I'd expected. Not a single document, but a set of them, perhaps 20 pages total, tabbed with those small adhesive arrow stickers that indicate signature lines. He laid them on the coffee table in front of me with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before, many times. This is a combined instrument, he said. A durable power of attorney, a financial management authorization, and a property administration agreement. In practical terms, it allows Logan and Vanessa to act on your behalf in financial and property matters, to simplify decisions, handle accounts, and if necessary, manage any sale or transfer of assets to make sure your long-term care needs are met. I let a silence sit there for a moment. I looked at the papers. I looked at the little adhesive arrows. Handle any sale or transfer of assets. Long-term care needs. There it was, wrapped in the language of protection and love, about as subtle as a hand around a throat that hasn't squeezed yet. That sounds like a lot, I said, and I let my voice carry just a small thread of uncertainty. Not helplessness, just a woman encountering complexity. It sounds like more than it is, Vanessa said gently. In practical terms, Evelyn, it means Logan can take things off your plate. The property taxes, the accounts, the maintenance decisions, all of that becomes his to manage, so you don't have to worry. And the property itself? I said. My house? A brief exchange of glances between Paul Reeves and Vanessa, quick enough that they thought I didn't catch it. The administration agreement includes a provision, Paul said carefully, that in the event you decide, sir, or a medical professional determines, that independent living is no longer the best option, Logan and Vanessa would have the authority to make arrangements, including the property. I picked up the document. I turned it over in my hands the way Vanessa used to turn over my things. I looked at the signature lines. And this notarized? I said. Paul is a licensed notary, Vanessa said. Of course he was. I set the papers back on the table. I did not reach for a pen. I looked at my son. Logan, I said, look at me. He did. It cost him something. I could see that. His eyes had the particular quality of a man who has been told to believe one version of a story and is now being asked to look directly at another. Do you understand what these papers say? I asked him. Not what Vanessa or Paul told you they say, what they actually say. Mom, he started. Because what I'm hearing, I said, my voice still even, still without accusation, is that if I sign these documents, the two of you would have the legal authority to sell my home and put me in a facility. Is that what you understand them to say? It's not like that, Vanessa said quickly. It's a contingency, Evelyn, for emergencies. A contingency that requires my signature to activate, I said. Paul Reeves cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, I understand this can feel. I'd like a moment with my son, I said. Just my son. Another quick exchange of glances. Then Vanessa said lightly, Of course, Paul and I will step outside. They went to the porch. I heard the front door close. Logan and I sat looking at each other across the coffee table with those papers between us. Talk to me, I said. Not the version Vanessa prepared. Talk to me like my son. He put his elbows on his knees. He rubbed his face with both hands, and for a moment he looked very much like the boy he'd been at 16, sitting in the same room, trying to explain something he'd done that he knew was wrong. She says you're not managing well, he said finally, that you're behind on things, that the property is costing more than you have coming in. And you believe that? I said. I didn't want to, he said, but I also, Mom, I don't actually know what your finances look like. You've never talked about it. Because it's mine, I said. The same way your finances are yours. I've managed this property and everything on it for 41 years without anyone's help. I know, he said. Do you? I said. Not harshly, just needing him to hear it. He was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Logan, I said, I need you to understand something. If I sign those papers, I lose this house. Not maybe. Not in an emergency. Your wife has been planning this since before your wedding. You know that, don't you? On some level? He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. I'm not going to sign these, I said. He looked up. Mom, I'm not, I said, and my voice did not shake. And I need you to understand that I am not confused. I am not declining. I am not struggling in silence. I know exactly what is on this table and exactly what it would mean. Before he could answer, the front door opened and Vanessa came back in, and behind her, not Paul Reeves, not this time, came a cold draft of January air. Evelyn, she said, and the warmth was still there in her voice, but thinner now, like paint worn through in places. I know this feels sudden. These things always do. But the truth is, Logan and I have been talking to professionals. We've done the research, and this is genuinely the best thing. I'd like to keep the documents to review, I said. She paused. Of course. But we did hope to get this wrapped up today. Paul has other appointments. Then he should keep them, I said pleasantly. Something shifted in Vanessa's face. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, the expression of someone whose timeline has just been disrupted and is recalculating. Evelyn, her voice dropped half a register. The warmth stepped aside and something more direct moved in. I want to be honest with you. Logan and I are worried, not just about the property, about you. We've spoken with a doctor. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face still. A doctor, I said. A geriatric specialist, she said. Someone Logan and I consulted just to understand what signs to look for. And some of the things we've observed over the past few months. The way you've been a little forgetful, a little... What things? I said. Name one specific thing. She blinked. Well, you forgot Logan's birthday call this year. I called Logan on his birthday, I said. He didn't answer. I left a message. A beat. I have the phone record, I said. If you'd like to see it. Another beat. Longer. Vanessa looked at Paul Reeves, who had reappeared in the doorway. He looked at his briefcase. Logan was staring at the carpet. And I looked at all of them, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Calm. Real calm, not the performed kind. Because I had been waiting for the lie that was too specific to survive contact with the truth, and she had just told it, and it had done exactly what lies do when they meet evidence. I reached into my cardigan pocket and took out my phone. My thumb found Calvin's number. I pressed call. It rang twice. Evelyn, Calvin said. Ready when you are. Ready, I said. I set the phone on the coffee table, face up, speaker on. Vanessa's eyes went to it. Who is... she started. The knock at the front door was firm and deliberate. Logan went very still. I got up from Gerald's chair and walked to the door and opened it, and Calvin Mercer stood on my porch with two other people, a woman I hadn't met, holding a digital recorder, and a man in his 40s in a dark jacket who introduced himself with the quiet authority of someone who carries a badge. Mrs. Carter, Calvin said, I'm sorry for the timing. I believe we're needed. I stepped back and let them in. What happened in the next few minutes was not the dramatic confrontation that people imagine when they picture a scene like this. There was no shouting. There was no moment where anyone collapsed or confessed. Real life doesn't work that way. It's messier than that, quieter in the wrong moments and louder in the ones you don't expect. Paul Reeves looked at the man with the badge and went the particular color of a person doing rapid private arithmetic. Vanessa stood very still, and I watched her process it. The arrival at the door, the recorder, Calvin's presence, my phone on the table. Watched her understand in real time that the room she had walked into was not the room she had prepared for. Her eyes moved from Calvin to me, and in that half second I saw something in her face that she could not fully control. Not guilt, not yet. Calculation. Still calculating, still looking for the exit. This is a private family matter, she said to Calvin. Firm, professional. Impressive, honestly, given the circumstances. Mrs. Carter asked me to be here, Calvin said, and the documents your associate was presenting to her contain several provisions I'd like to examine. He looked at Paul Reeves. Mr. Reeves, he said, I'm going to need your notary credentials and the originating authority for these documents. The preparation paperwork, the authorization chain, all of it. Paul Reeves looked at his briefcase. He looked at the badge. He said quietly, I may need to make a call. You're welcome to, Calvin said. Logan had not moved from the couch. He was sitting with his hands between his knees, and he was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a child. Something raw and disoriented, like a person waking up in a room they don't immediately recognize. I looked back at him. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see my face, the face of the mother who had loved him without condition for 43 years, in this room, in this house, on this day that had been designed to take all of it from her. I wanted him to see it clearly. Because the thing about a reckoning is that it doesn't happen to one person in a room. It happens to everyone. And whatever came next, the investigation, the legal proceedings, the unwinding of whatever Vanessa had built, Logan was going to have to live with the fact that he had been in this room, that he had brought these people to my door, that he had sat on my couch and looked at that carpet while his wife told lies about me in my own living room, He was going to have to decide what to do with that. The investigator was going through the documents now, methodically, page by page. Calvin was on his phone in the kitchen doorway. The woman with the recorder was asking Paul Reeves questions in a low, professional voice, and he was answering them with the increasingly careful tone of a man who has just understood that being on the wrong side of this situation is a legal problem, not just a personal one. Vanessa had sat down. She was very still. The warmth, the practiced concern, the measured smile, all of it had receded, and what sat in my living room chair was a woman who had made a plan and watched it stop working in real time. I stood in my kitchen doorway and looked at my living room full of people. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post by the garden and sat there for a moment, looking at the frozen ground. Then it flew off into the pale January sky. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would say if he could see this room right now. I thought he would probably say very little, because he was a man who had always preferred to act over speaking. I thought he would have put his hand on my shoulder. I felt very clearly the absence of that hand. And then Calvin came back from the kitchen and said, "Evelyn, there's something in these documents I need you to see." And I turned back to the room and we got to work. What Calvin needed me to see was buried on page 11 of the 20-page document set. A clause written in the kind of language that is specifically designed to not be read. Dense, subordinate, tucked between two paragraphs about healthcare directives and indemnification. He had circled it in pencil while he was on the phone in my kitchen doorway, and he set it in front of me on the table without saying anything, just pointed. I read it twice. The clause authorized Logan and Vanessa, upon execution of the power of attorney, to act as sole trustees of any real property held in my name, including property not specifically enumerated in the document. Any property, not just the house on Miller Road. Any property held in my name. They didn't know about the ranch. I was certain of that. But someone, Paul Reeves or whoever had drafted these documents, had written the language broadly enough to capture anything. A fishing net, not a spear. Cast wide and see what comes up. I looked up at Calvin. He looked back at me. "They went wide," I said quietly. "They went very wide," he said, "which tells me whoever drafted this was thorough. This isn't a document that was put together over a weekend." I thought about that, about the timeline. The wedding had been June. The folder with the brochures had appeared in October. These documents had language that took time to draft, review, and prepare. Someone had been working on this before October. Possibly before the wedding. I set the document down. There are moments when the full shape of something becomes visible all at once, like when you step back from a painting you've been standing too close to and suddenly see what it actually is. I had been telling myself that Vanessa had started this after the wedding, that Logan's distance and her pressure campaign were things that had developed gradually in the months since June. But the document said otherwise. The document said someone had been planning this longer than I'd understood. She had married my son with this already in motion. I don't know that I had a word for what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just betrayal, though it was that. It was something more like the ground shifting. That sensation when a thing you thought was solid turns out to have been hollow underneath all along. Calvin touched my arm briefly. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "Ask," I said. "The ranch," he said. "Where's the deed?" "My safe," I said. "In the bedroom." He nodded once. "I think it's time." I want to tell you what the room looked like when I came back from the bedroom with that deed in my hand, because I think it matters. Vanessa was sitting in the armchair with her phone face down in her lap, no longer making any pretense of warmth or concern. The mask had not fallen off dramatically. It had simply become unnecessary, the way a coat comes off when you're already indoors and everyone knows it. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been caught mid-reach and was now assessing the damage. Paul Reeves was at the far end of the couch, answering the investigator's questions with the voice of a man carefully choosing every word. His briefcase was open on the floor beside him, the documents inside it being photographed one by the woman with the recorder. He had, I noticed, stopped looking at Vanessa entirely. The particular avoidance of a person who has understood that the alliance he walked in with is no longer one he wants to be publicly affiliated with. Logan was still in the same spot. He had not moved, barely, in the past 40 minutes. There was coffee in front of him that had gone cold. He was looking at nothing. I walked to the center of the room and I set the deed on the coffee table. Not dramatically, not the way you'd imagine it in a movie, some kind of flourish. I just set it down, flat, the way you'd set down a grocery list. "There's something I'd like everyone here to see," I said. Calvin was already moving. He picked up the deed, examined it briefly, and passed it to the investigator, a man named Garrett, I had learned, who worked in financial fraud out of the county office 2 towns over. Garrett looked at it. He looked at the address. He looked at the parcel number. He looked at Calvin. "This is recorded?" Garrett said. "Recorded and clear," Calvin said. "No liens, no mortgages. Sole ownership, her name only, uncontested since the original conveyance." Garrett set it on the table and looked at Vanessa. I watched him look at her. It was the look of someone adding a column of numbers and arriving at a total that has changed the nature of the problem. Vanessa looked at the deed. Then she looked at me. And I looked back at her, and I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, because I think that's what a story like this is supposed to contain. The moment of reversal, the look on the villain's face, the clean satisfaction of justice. But the truth is more complicated than that. What I felt was something tired and sad and old under the steadiness, because the woman across from me had made herself into a predator, and the man on my couch, the man I had brought home from the hospital 43 years ago, the boy I had read to sleep and driven to school and worried over and loved without limit, had let her into my home and sat there while she tried to take everything. That was the thing that kept landing, underneath everything else. Not Vanessa. Vanessa was a stranger who had done stranger things. Logan was my son. "Evelyn?" Vanessa's voice, when it came, was different from any version of it I had heard before. Not warm, not measured, not professional, just flat and direct. "That property was never mentioned. We had no idea." "I know you didn't," I said. "That was the point." A silence. "The document Mr. Reeves prepared," Calvin said from across the room, "contains language broad enough to have captured this property upon execution. Whether or not that was the specific intent, the effect would have been the same." He looked at Garrett. "That's relevant to the question of scope." Garrett nodded and wrote something down. "I want a lawyer," Paul Reeves said. It was the first thing he'd volunteered in 20 minutes. "That's your right," Garrett said without looking up. "What?" "I don't want to give you the impression that the next several hours were orderly, because they were not. Legal proceedings, even preliminary ones, are not clean. People get phone calls. People step outside. Papers get looked at by multiple people in sequence, handed back and forth, questioned and re-examined. Calvin was on his phone 3 times. Garrett's colleague arrived, another investigator, a woman named Tran, and the 2 of them worked through the documents with the patient efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that thoroughness now prevented problems later. Vanessa called someone. I didn't hear the conversation. She took it on the porch, but when she came back in, she sat down and didn't say anything else for a long time. Logan asked me, at some point in the middle of all of it, if he could speak to me in the kitchen. I looked at him for a moment. Then I nodded. We stood by the kitchen counter, not far apart, and I noticed that he looked like he'd aged in the past 2 hours. Not physically, but something in the way he was carrying himself was different. The particular posture of a person whose version of events has been revised in real time and hasn't yet figured out what replaces it. "Mom," he said. "I didn't know about the ranch." "I know you didn't," I said. "I didn't know what was in those documents," he said. "Not the details. She told me it was—" He stopped, pressed his mouth closed, started again. "She told me it was just financial planning, standard stuff, to protect you." "Logan," I said, "you brought a notary to my house." He flinched. "I know. You sat on my couch while a man told me he could authorize the sale of my property if someone decided I wasn't capable of living independently." I know," he said again, and his voice had gone rough in a way that I recognized. The sound of someone who has been holding something at a distance and has just run out of distance to hold it at. Did you know she'd been planning this before the wedding? I asked. It was the question I'd been sitting with since I read the clause on page 11, and I needed to ask it directly, even though I was afraid of what he'd say. He looked at me. His face was its own answer, not the answer of a man confessing. The answer of a man who doesn't know, who genuinely cannot tell me with certainty, and that uncertainty was in some ways more devastating than a clear yes would have been, because it meant he had been close enough to all of this to have known, and had chosen, on some level, not to look. I don't know, he said. I don't know when it started. I nodded. I looked out the kitchen window at the frozen yard, the same yard I had looked out at for 41 years. I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not angry at you because you have a wife who wanted things from me. People want things. That's human. I'm angry at you because you are my son, and you sat on that couch. He said nothing. You could have called me, I said. At any point in the past 6 months, you could have called me privately and said, Mom, I don't understand what's happening, or Mom, I'm being asked to be part of something I'm not sure about. You could have done that. I know, he whispered. But you didn't, I said, and I need you to sit with that, not for my sake, for yours. I went back into the living room. It was mid-afternoon by the time Garrett had everything he needed for the initial phase of the investigation. He explained to me, carefully, without legal promises, that what he'd documented constituted grounds for a formal fraud inquiry. The documents had multiple irregularities. Paul Reeves's notary status, it turned out, had a complication. His commission had expired 4 months prior, which meant any notarization he performed was legally void and potentially fraudulent. The language of the instruments themselves had been structured in a way that obscured their true function. What was framed as a planning document was, in practical effect, a mechanism for involuntary asset transfer. What happens to him? I asked, meaning Paul Reeves. That depends on what the investigation finds, Garrett said, but operating as a notary with an expired commission on a document that misrepresents its purpose to an elder, that's not a small problem. Paul Reeves left my house that afternoon without his briefcase. Garrett took it as part of the documentation. He walked out to his car and drove away, and I have not seen him since. Vanessa left shortly after. She walked past me in the hallway without saying anything. Not an apology. I hadn't expected one. Not a threat. I think by then she understood that threats had no more purchase here. She just walked past me in her expensive coat, and I stepped back to let her through, and she went out the front door. The last thing I saw was her profile as she walked to the car, that careful, precise face, looking straight ahead. Not at Logan's truck, not at the house. Ahead. Already somewhere else in her mind. Logan stood in the driveway for a moment after her car was gone. He stood there in the January cold without his jacket, just stood there with his hands at his sides, and I watched him from the doorway. He turned and looked at the house. Looked at me. I'm sorry, he said. 2 words, out there in the cold. I don't know what I expected from that moment. Some kind of release, maybe. Some sensation of a knot coming loose. What I actually felt was much smaller and quieter than that. Just the ordinary sadness of a mother watching her son stand in the cold having arrived, too late and the wrong way, at a truth he should have found months ago. I know, I said. Is there anything I can do? Not today, I said. Go home, Logan. We'll talk. He nodded. He got in his truck. He drove away. I stood in the doorway alone and let the cold air come in around me for a moment before I closed the door. Calvin stayed another hour. We sat at the kitchen table with the deed between us, and he walked me through the next steps with the patience of a man who understood that information is only useful if it's absorbed, not just heard. The ranch, he explained, needed to be formally registered with updated contact information and a documented protective trust structure going forward. Not because it was at risk now. It wasn't. The fraud investigation had effectively neutralized the immediate threat. But because proper documentation was a permanent protection that I should have established years ago and hadn't, simply because I'd never thought I'd need it. Gerald put it in your name for a reason, Calvin said. Now we make sure it stays there, with walls around it. What kind of walls? I asked. A properly structured trust, he said, with independent trustees named by you. Not Logan. Not anyone you're currently in a family relationship with. People you choose, with no stake in the outcome. I thought of Dorothy. I thought of a few others. I can do that, I said. He gathered his things to leave, and at the door he paused and looked at me with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of these situations and has learned not to make predictions. You held up very well today, he said. A lot of people, when the room fills up the way it did, they lose their footing. You didn't. I had a good reason not to, I said. After he left, the house was very quiet. I walked through it again the way I had that day in October, after Vanessa left the folder on my coffee table. Every room, slowly. The kitchen, the hallway, Gerald's study, my bedroom, where the safe sat in the closet, empty now of the document that had changed everything in that living room. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time. The ranch, 60 miles east through country that got rough and wide open before it gentled into pasture. Ramon and Lucia's lights probably on by now, the cattle settled for the evening, the creek frozen at the edges but running through the middle the way it always did, stubborn and quiet and continuous. Gerald had looked at a piece of land 40 years ago and seen something worth protecting, not just dirt and grass, a foundation, a guarantee, a thing that could stand between someone he loved and the worst of what people were capable of. He had put my name on it and never made a performance of it, never said, "Look what I've done for you," just did it the way he did most things, quietly, practically, thinking further ahead than I ever gave him credit for. The grief of missing him hit me differently that evening than it usually did. Not the soft daily grief of a familiar absence, something sharper, more specific. I wished he could have been in that living room. Not to see Vanessa's face when the documents were examined, or Paul Reeves going pale, or the investigator writing in his notebook. Not for any of that. I just wanted Gerald to know that the thing he'd done, that quiet, careful thing, had mattered in exactly the way he'd intended. I went to the kitchen and made dinner for one, the way I did every night. Soup, bread, the radio on low. Ordinary things, made strange by the weight of the day. I sat at the table and ate and let the silence be what it was. The green notebook was still on the counter, 18 entries. I opened it to a new page and wrote the date, and then I sat for a moment with the pen in my hand, thinking about what to write. Finally I wrote, "Today they came. Today I did not sign." Today, the deed was on the table and the room understood what it meant. Then I wrote one more line, the one I hadn't been able to say aloud to anyone because there was no one to say it to. It isn't over yet, but I'm still here, and this is still mine. I closed the notebook. I put the soup bowl in the sink. I turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the January dark had settled completely over the property, over the frozen yard and the bare fence line and the 32 acres that had held my life for 41 years. And somewhere 60 miles east, in country wide enough to make you feel like the world had more room in it than you'd been operating under, a piece of land waited in the dark with my name on it, patient, silent, exactly where Gerald had left it. I went to bed, and this time I did not lie awake. The weeks after that Saturday did not feel like victory. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a certain kind of story, the kind where the moment the threat is neutralized, everything gets bright and easy, where the woman who has been wronged walks out into clean sunlight and everything settles into its right place. That is not what happened. What happened was that the house got very quiet, the investigation ground forward at the pace that legal processes always grind, and I woke up every morning into the same complicated life I had always had, just with different things in it now. Garrett's office was thorough. Over the following 6 weeks, Calvin kept me updated in measured increments. What had been confirmed, what was still being examined, what the likely trajectory was. Paul Reeves's expired notary commission was the cleanest piece of it. That had no ambiguity. He had presented himself as a licensed notary on a legal instrument while operating with a commission that had lapsed, and he had done it in the context of a document designed to transfer asset control from an elderly woman to parties who stood to benefit financially. That combination had a name in the law, and the name was not a comfortable one. The documents themselves, the power of attorney, the financial management authorization, the property administration agreement, were found to have been prepared by a firm 2 states over that Calvin described to me as operating in a gray area. Not an outright fraud operation, but a practice that specialized in instruments for families seeking to gain financial authority over older relatives. Instruments that were technically legal in isolation, but structured in ways that courts had found problematic when the circumstances surrounding them were examined. Garrett's colleague, investigator Tran, had apparently encountered this firm before. Vanessa's direct legal exposure was more complicated, Calvin explained, because she had not prepared the documents herself. She had engaged people to prepare them, and the question of what she had directed versus what she had simply signed off on without full understanding was the kind of thing that took time to establish. I did not follow every detail. What I understood was this: the scheme had unraveled. It had unraveled before I signed anything, and the people who had built it were now answering questions they had not planned to answer. Paul Reeves entered into an agreement with the county office that resulted in the permanent revocation of his notary commission, among other consequences. I did not ask for further details. Calvin offered them, and I told him I had enough. What I needed to focus on was the trust. We established it in February. Calvin guided me through every decision: the structure, the trustees, the terms. Dorothy was my first call. She picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what I needed, she said, "Evelyn, I have been waiting for you to ask me to do something useful for 6 months." And I laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long while. The other trustees were a man named Herbert Okafor, a retired judge I had known peripherally through Gerald's professional connections, and a woman named Sandra Reyes, who ran the legal aid office in the next county and whom Calvin had recommended for reasons that became clear the more I understood about what she did. The trust placed both properties, the house on Miller Road and the ranch, under a structure that I controlled entirely during my lifetime, with protections that would require multiple independent parties to act in concert before any significant decision could be made about either property. Not a complicated arrangement, just a solid one. The kind of thing that should probably exist for anyone who owns land and has family members who might someday disagree about what to do with it. Gerald would have done this years ago, I told Calvin when we signed the final papers. Most people don't, he said. They think about it and they put it off because it means thinking about difficult things. You did it because you had to, but the effect is the same. I drove home that afternoon through February cold, past fields that were bare and gray and waiting for spring, and I thought about the word protection. How long I had misunderstood what it meant. I had thought protection was something you gave other people, your children, your spouse. I had not understood, not fully, that it was also something you owed yourself. Logan called in March. Not the careful, managed calls of the past year, the ones where he sounded like he was performing normalcy from behind a distance. This was different. He called on a Tuesday evening, and when I answered, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke, the way people are quiet when they've been thinking about something for a long time and have finally run out of reasons to wait. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I don't want you to. I'm not calling for forgiveness. I just need to say it." "All right," I said. "I knew it wasn't right," he said. "Not all of it. Not the details. But I knew, on some level, that what we were doing was... I kept telling myself it was for you, that it was care. But I knew. Somewhere I knew." I sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because she's gone," he said. "Vanessa. She left in February. It's over." I had expected to feel something sharp at that news. Relief, or told you so, or some version of satisfaction. What I actually felt was a kind of exhausted sorrow, for all of it, for the whole arc of the thing, for the version of my son who had fallen in love with someone who used that love as a means to an end, for the years this had taken from both of us that we were not going to get back. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me a little. Not sorry that she was gone, sorry that he had to go through the unraveling of it, sorry that love, even when it's aimed at the wrong target, still hurts when it ends. "You're sorry," he repeated, like he hadn't expected that word from me. "You're my son," I said. "I don't stop caring about what happens to you because you made bad choices. That's not how this works." He was quiet again for a long moment. "How does it work then?" "Slowly. I said, and with a lot of honesty, and you don't get to skip the honest part because it's uncomfortable. No, he said. I know. We talked for 40 minutes that night. Not about the investigation, not about the documents or the living room or any of the specific mechanics of what had happened. About other things. About Gerald. About a summer when Logan was 12 and we all drove out to see a piece of land his father had inherited from an uncle, and Logan had complained the whole way about being bored, and Gerald had let him complain without comment. And when they got there, Gerald had just stood in the pasture for a while with his hands in his pockets, looking at the horizon. I never understood what he saw in that land, Logan said. It wasn't what he saw, I said. It was what he was thinking about. What was he thinking about? Us, I said. He was always thinking about us. Logan was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke again, his voice was thicker than before. I want to do better, he said. I know that's easy to say. It is easy to say, I agreed. So don't say it too much, just do it. He called the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Spring came to the ranch the way spring always does in that part of the country, gradually and then all at once, the pasture going from winter gray to a green so sharp it almost looked wrong. I had started driving out every few weeks, not just to check on things, though I did that too, partly just to be there, to stand on that porch the way Gerald had stood in the pasture 40 years ago, with my hands in my pockets, thinking. Ramon and Lucia had been confused, at first, by my increased presence. Not unwelcoming, they had always been gracious, but uncertain about what it meant. One afternoon in April, I sat on the porch with Lucia and just told her. Not all of it, but enough. About the documents, about what had almost happened, about the trust. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me. My mother's house, she said. Her brother sold it when she was in the hospital. She came home and it was gone. She never talked about it, but it stayed in her, like something broken that never set right. I looked at her. I'm sorry. I'm glad you didn't sign, she said simply. That afternoon, sitting on that porch in the April warmth, I started thinking about something that had been forming at the edges of my mind since February. Since Sandra Reyes, one of my trustees, had told me over coffee after one of our meetings about the number of people she saw in her legal aid work who were in situations like mine had been, or worse. Older adults whose families had already gotten the signatures, who had already lost the house, already been placed, already had their financial lives handed over to people who treated them like burdens or like resources, depending on the day. How many? I'd asked her. In this county alone, she said. More than you'd think. And most of them don't have a Calvin Mercer. Most of them don't know they can push back. That number had not left me. I talked to Calvin about it in May. I had an idea that I had been turning over long enough that it had gotten real enough to say out loud, and I wanted someone practical to tell me whether it was possible or just a 70-year-old woman with too much time and a large piece of land. The ranch has the main house, I said, which is larger than what the Delgados need, and there's the equipment shed they built, and the south pasture that isn't being used for cattle. What I'm thinking is a center, not a facility, not an institution, a place where people could come for legal guidance, for counseling, to understand their options before they're in the room with the documents. Calvin looked at me for a long moment over his desk. A resource center, he said. Call it what you want, I said. I want it to be the thing I didn't have, the thing that someone like me can walk into and say, I think something is wrong, and have someone actually listen. That takes money, he said. Operating costs, staff, liability. I know, I said. I've been doing the math. He raised his eyebrows slightly. I handed him the folder I'd put together over the past 3 weeks. Numbers, estimates, a rough structural plan that Sandra had helped me think through. He read through it in silence. When he looked up, he said, This is not a small undertaking. I know, I said. You'd be committing a significant portion of the ranch's operating income for the first few years, at minimum. I know that too. And you want to do it anyway. I didn't protect myself so I could just sit on a porch and watch the grass grow, I said. That land was put in my name so it could be useful. I'm trying to make it useful. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sandra will want to be involved. I was planning to ask her. The county legal aid office has grant programs, he said, for exactly this kind of community legal support initiative. I know, I said. Sandra already told me about them. He looked at me. A small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't announce itself. You've already talked to Sandra. Last week, I said. The Carter Ranch Legal Resource Center, that was the name we landed on, after a long conversation with Dorothy, who said we should call it something plain and honest, something that said exactly what it was without making people feel like they needed to dress up to walk through the door. We opened in September, not with a ceremony, I specifically did not want a ceremony, just a morning when the door was unlocked and the coffee was made and Sandra's intake coordinator was at the front desk, and 3 people came in that first week and sat down in the front room and talked about things they had been afraid to say anywhere else. By December, we had seen 31 people. Not all of them were in crisis. Some of them were exactly where I had been in October, a year before, sitting with a folder of brochures on their coffee table, not yet sure what it meant, just knowing something felt wrong. Those were the ones I was most glad to see, because they had come before the signature, before the line that is so much harder to come back from. I sat in on some of the consultations when people consented to it, not to advise, that was for Sandra's team and the attorneys we'd partnered with, just to be present, to be the person in the room who could look at someone and say, without any professional framing, I understand what it feels like to sit in your own home and feel it being taken from you, and I can tell you that you do not have to let it happen. Dorothy came out every Tuesday. She organized the library of resource materials we kept for visitors, and she made the coffee, and she had a quality I had underestimated for 40 years, an ability to make a frightened person feel like they were sitting in someone's kitchen rather than a legal office. That quality was worth more than most of what money could have paid for. Logan came to the opening. He drove out on that September morning and stood in the front room of the ranch house and looked around at what we'd built, and I watched his face. Mom, he said. Don't, I said, not unkindly. Not today. Today is not about all of that. He nodded. He stayed most of the day. He helped Dale move furniture. He was quiet and useful, and he did not ask for anything, which was exactly the right thing to be. It was not fixed between us. I want to be clear about that. Some things that break do not return to their original shape, and a relationship between a mother and a son who brought a notary to her house is one of those things. We had been talking every week since March. We had said honest things to each other that I think both of us had needed to say and hear for longer than either of us had admitted. There was real work being done, the slow, undecorated kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but is actually the hardest kind. Whether it would get to a place that felt like what we'd had before, I didn't know. I still don't. What I know is that Logan shows up now in the ways that matter, not with grand gestures, with phone calls on ordinary Tuesdays, with a willingness to hear things that are difficult to hear, with the particular quality of a person who has looked at something he did and chosen not to look away from it, which is harder than it sounds. That is not nothing. It is not everything. It is what we have. Vanessa did not contact me again after that January day. I have no information about where she went or what she did next. I do not think about her as often as you might expect. What I think about more when I think about the whole of it is the design of what she had built, the patience of it, the gradual escalation, the way each small thing was calibrated to stay just below the threshold where you could name it clearly. I think about how many people there are who operate this way, who have understood that the most effective way to take something from a person is to make them doubt whether they're capable of keeping it. That is what the Resource Center is for, not to punish people like Vanessa. The law handles that, imperfectly, in its own time, to interrupt the doubt, to give people something to stand on before the ground gets taken out from under them. Twas, I want to speak to you directly now, not as Evelyn Carter telling her story, as a person who has lived long enough to know some things with certainty and who believes you deserve to hear them plainly. If there is someone in your life right now who is questioning your ability to manage your own affairs, who is pushing you toward decisions that benefit them more than you, who uses the language of love and concern to justify reaching for what is yours. Hear me. That is not love. Love does not come with a leather folder and a notary. Love does not keep track of your property value. Love does not require your signature. You have the right to your own home, your own money, your own choices. Not because you have earned it by being perfect, or because your family agrees with you, or because a document says so. Because you are a person, and your life is your own, and no one, not your children, not their spouses, not anyone who smiles at you over Sunday dinner, gets to take that from you because they have decided you are old enough to be managed. Get a lawyer who is yours, not a family lawyer, not someone your children suggested, someone who works for you. Tell them what you have. Show them what you've been asked to sign. Document the conversations that feel wrong. Trust the feeling that something is wrong, because that feeling is usually right, and the people who are trying to take advantage of you are counting on you to talk yourself out of it. And if someone tries to tell you that protecting yourself is selfish, that standing firm is unkind, that a good mother or a good father would simply trust and agree, I want you to think about what Gerald did. A quiet man who said very little and thought very far ahead and put a piece of land in his wife's name because he loved her enough to protect her from things neither of them could see yet. That is what love actually looks like. Not possession, not control, not the management of another person's life for your own benefit. Protection. Freely given, with no signature required. I'm 70 years old. I live on 32 acres that I have kept for 41 years. 60 miles east, on open land that goes wider than you remember land being, a resource center is open on Tuesday mornings, and there is always coffee, and there is always someone who will listen. My son calls on Tuesdays. Dorothy comes every week. The Delgado family tends the cattle, and the creek runs clear through the middle of the south pasture, and the tomatoes, come August, are still something remarkable. Gerald would have loved them. I am still here. This is still mine. And I have learned, later than I should have, with more pain than was necessary, but learned nonetheless, that those two sentences are worth protecting with everything you have, because they are everything. Spring came to the ranch the way spring always does in that part of the country. Gradually, and then all at once, the pasture going from winter gray to a green so sharp it almost looked wrong. I had started driving out every few weeks, not just to check on things, though I did that too, partly just to be there, to stand on that porch the way Gerald had stood in the pasture 40 years ago, with my hands in my pockets, thinking. Ramon and Lucia had been confused at first by my increased presence, not unwelcoming. They had always been gracious, but uncertain about what it meant. One afternoon in April, I sat on the porch with Lucia and just told her, not all of it, but enough, about the documents, about what had almost happened, about the trust. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me. My mother's house, she said. Her brother sold it when she was in the hospital. She came home and it was gone. She never talked about it, but it stayed in her, like something broken that never set right. I looked at her. I'm sorry. I'm glad you didn't sign, she said simply. That afternoon, sitting on that porch in the April warmth, I started thinking about something that had been forming at the edges of my mind since February. Since Sandra Reyes, one of my trustees, had told me, over coffee after one of our meetings, about the number of people she saw in her legal aid work who were in situations like mine had been, or worse. Older adults whose families had already gotten the signatures, who had already lost the house, already been placed, already had their financial lives handed over to people who treated them like burdens or like resources, depending on the day. How many? I had asked her. In this county alone? She said. More than you'd think. And most of them don't have a Calvin Mercer. Most of them don't know they can push back. That number had not left me. What? I talked to Calvin about it in May. I had an idea that I had been turning over long enough that it had gotten real enough to say out loud, and I wanted someone practical to tell me whether it was possible or just a 70-year-old woman with too much time and a large piece of land. The ranch has the main house, I said, which is larger than what the Delgados need, and there's the equipment shed they built, and the south pasture that isn't being used for cattle. What I'm thinking is a center, not a facility, not an institution, a place where people could come for legal guidance, for counseling, to understand their options before they're in the room with the documents. Calvin looked at me for a long moment over his desk. A resource center, he said. Call it what you want, I said. I want it to be the thing I didn't have, the thing that someone like me can walk into and say, I think something is wrong, and have someone actually listen. That takes money, he said. Operating costs, staff, liability. I know, I said. I've been doing the math. He raised his eyebrows slightly. I handed him the folder I'd put together over the past 3 weeks. Numbers, estimates, a rough structural plan that Sandra had helped me think through. He read through it in silence. When he looked up, he said, This is not a small undertaking. I know, I said. You'd be committing a significant portion of the ranch's operating income for the first few years, at minimum. I know that too. And you want to do it anyway. I didn't protect myself so I could just sit on a porch and watch the grass grow, I said. That land was put in my name so it could be useful. I'm trying to make it useful. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sandra will want to be involved. I was planning to ask her. The county legal aid office has grant programs, he said, for exactly this kind of community legal support initiative. I know, I said. Sandra already told me about them. He looked at me. A small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't announce itself. You've already talked to Sandra. Last week, I said. The Carter Ranch Legal Resource Center, that was the name we landed on, after a long conversation with Dorothy, who said we should call it something plain and honest, something that said exactly what it was without making people feel like they needed to dress up to walk through the door. We opened in September. Not with a ceremony. I specifically did not want a ceremony. Just a morning when the door was unlocked and the coffee was made, and Sandra's intake coordinator was at the front desk, and 3 people came in that first week and sat down in the front room and talked about things they had been afraid to say anywhere else. By December, we had seen 31 people. Not all of them were in crisis. Some of them were exactly where I had been in October, a year before, sitting with a folder of brochures on their coffee table, not yet sure what it meant, just knowing something felt wrong. Those were the ones I was most glad to see because they had come before the signature, before the line that is so much harder to come back from. I sat in on some of the consultations when people consented to it, not to advise, and that was for Sandra's team and the attorneys we'd partnered with, just to be present, to be the person in the room who could look at someone and say, without any professional framing, I understand what it feels like to sit in your own home and feel it being taken from you, and I can tell you that you do not have to let it happen. Dorothy came out every Tuesday. She organized the library of resource materials we kept for visitors, and she made the coffee, and she had a quality I had underestimated for 40 years, an ability to make a frightened person feel like they were sitting in someone's kitchen rather than a legal office. That quality was worth more than most of what money could have paid for. Logan came to the opening. He drove out on that September morning and stood in the front room of the ranch house and looked around at what we'd built, and I watched his face. Mom, he said. Don't, I said, not unkindly. Not today. Today is not about all of that. He nodded. He stayed most of the day. He helped Dale move furniture. He was quiet and useful, and he did not ask for anything, which was exactly the right thing to be. It was not fixed between us. I want to be clear about that. Some things that break do not return to their original shape, and a relationship between a mother and a son who brought a notary to her house is one of those things. We had been talking every week since March. We had said honest things to each other that I think both of us had needed to say and hear for longer than either of us had admitted. There was real work being done, the slow, undecorated kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside but is actually the hardest kind. Whether it would get to a place that felt like what we'd had before, I didn't know. I still don't. What I know is that Logan shows up now in the ways that matter, not with grand gestures, with phone calls on ordinary Tuesdays, with a willingness to hear things that are difficult to hear, with the particular quality of a person who has looked at something he did and chosen not to look away from it, which is harder than it sounds. That is not nothing. It is not everything. It is what we have. Vanessa did not contact me again after that January day. I have no information about where she went or what she did next. I do not think about her as often as you might expect. What I think about more, when I think about the whole of it, is the design of what she had built, the patience of it, the gradual escalation, the way each small thing was calibrated to stay just below the threshold where you could name it clearly. I think about how many people there are who operate this way, who have understood that the most effective way to take something from a person is to make them doubt whether they're capable of keeping it. That is what the Resource Center is for, not to punish people like Vanessa. The law handles that imperfectly, in its own time, to interrupt the doubt, to give people something to stand on before the ground gets taken out from under them. I want to speak to you directly now, not as Evelyn Carter telling her story, as a person who has lived long enough to know some things with certainty and who believes you deserve to hear them plainly. If there is someone in your life right now who is questioning your ability to manage your own affairs, who is pushing you toward decisions that benefit them more than you, who uses the language of love and concern to justify reaching for what is yours, hear me, that is not love. Love does not come with a leather folder and a notary. Love does not keep track of your property value. Love does not require your signature. You have the right to your own home, your own money, your own choices, not because you have earned it by being perfect, or because your family agrees with you, or because a document says so, because you are a person and your life is your own, and no one, not your children, not their spouses, not anyone who smiles at you over Sunday dinner, gets to take that from you because they have decided you are old enough to be managed. Get a lawyer who is yours, not a family lawyer, not someone your children suggested, someone who works for you. Tell them what you have. Show them what you've been asked to sign. Document the conversations that feel wrong. Trust the feeling that something is wrong because that feeling is usually right. And the people who are trying to take advantage of you are counting on you to talk yourself out of it. And if someone tries to tell you that protecting yourself is selfish, that standing firm is unkind, that a good mother or a good father would simply trust and agree, I want you to think about what Gerald did. A quiet man who said very little and thought very far ahead and put a piece of land in his wife's name because he loved her enough to protect her from things neither of them could see yet. That is what love actually looks like. Not possession, not control, not the management of another person's life for your own benefit. Protection. Freely given. With no signature required. I am 70 years old. I live on 32 acres that I have kept for 41 years. 60 miles east, on open land that goes wider than you remember land being, a resource center is open on Tuesday mornings, and there is always coffee, and there is always someone who will listen. My son calls on Tuesdays. Dorothy comes every week. The Delgado family tends the cattle, and the creek runs clear through the middle of the south pasture, and the tomatoes, come August, are still something remarkable. Gerald would have loved them. I am still here. This is still mine. And I have learned, later than I should have, with more pain than was necessary, but learned nonetheless, that those two sentences are worth protecting with everything you have, because they are everything.